When your stepfather throws your suitcase into the driveway on a gray October morning and tells you 16 is old enough to figure life out, the world doesn't end with thunder. It ends with a soft thump of vinyl luggage hitting wet gravel and a screen door clicking shut behind him. My little brother Caleb stood on the porch in his school clothes, his backpack still slung over one shoulder, and I watched his face go from confused to crumpled to carefully, terribly blank. He was 12 years old. He had learned that face from me. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. If you've ever been told you were too much for the people who are supposed to love you, if you've ever been handed a garbage bag instead of goodbye, then sit with me for a while. This story is for you. Hit subscribe and stay close, because some inheritances don't come from the living. Some come howling out of the woods when you need them most. My name is Wren Halloway. My brother is Caleb. Our mother married a man named Doug Briggs 18 months after our father's funeral, and from the first dinner he sat at our table, I knew the shape of what was coming. Doug had a smile that arrived 3 seconds after his eyes did. He talked about discipline the way some men talk about religion. Our mother, who had once been the kind of woman who danced barefoot in the kitchen, started flinching at sounds I couldn't hear. The morning he kicked us out, I had told him no. He had wanted Caleb to skip school and help him tear down a shed in the backyard. Caleb had a math test. I said Caleb was going to school. Doug said, "Then maybe you'd both like to find somewhere else to be." I thought he was bluffing until I heard the suitcases hit the gravel. Our mother stood at the kitchen window. She did not come out. She did not wave. She lifted one hand to the glass and let it fall again, and that small, defeated motion was the closest thing to goodbye we got. I had $312 saved from a summer babysitting job. Caleb had a Ziploc bag of birthday money, $46, mostly in fives. We had 2 suitcases between us, a backpack of school books Caleb refused to leave behind, and a winter coat each, because it was October in northern Michigan, and even 16-year-olds know what's coming when the maples turn. We walked the 2 miles into town with our suitcases bumping behind us on cracked sidewalks. Caleb didn't cry. He kept asking questions in a small, even voice. Where would we sleep? Could we go to Aunt Marcy's? Was Mom going to call? I answered the ones I could and lied about the ones I couldn't. And by the time we reached the bus station, I had a plan that wasn't really a plan. It was a memory. Our grandfather, Eli Halloway, had owned a hunting lodge somewhere in the Upper Peninsula. He died when I was 11, and Caleb had been too young to remember him well. But I remembered. I remembered a man with a beard like steel wool and hands that could split, kindling without looking. I remembered him saying more than once that the lodge was for the kids when they need it. I remember my mother shaking her head at the funeral and saying the place was a wreck, that no one had been up there in years, that it wasn't worth the property taxes. I remembered, most of all, the brass key on the ring my grandfather had pressed into my hand the last summer he was alive. You hold on to this, Wren. You'll know when. I had been 11. I had thought he was being dramatic. I had kept the key in a jewelry box on my dresser for 5 years, and I had grabbed it that morning when I heard Doug's voice rising in the kitchen, the way you grab a flashlight when the power flickers. The bus to Marquette was $68 for the 2 of us. The transfer to a town called Ironwood Junction was another $41. By the time we boarded, I had $263 left, and no idea if the lodge was even still standing. Caleb fell asleep against my shoulder somewhere outside Gaylord. I watched the trees change through the window, birches turning to pines, pines turning to the deep, watchful spruce of the north, and I tried to remember everything my grandfather had ever said about that lodge. Off County Road 19, past the second iron bridge. The driveway looks like nothing. That's how I like it. It was almost dark when we stepped off the bus at Ironwood Junction. The air had teeth. There was no station, just a gas station with a hand-lettered sign that said coffee inside and a wooden bench bolted to the wall. The man behind the gas station counter was in his 60s, wearing a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. He looked at us, me with my suitcase, Caleb half asleep on his feet, and his eyes went somewhere quiet. "You kids lost. We're looking for the old Holloway place," I said. "On County Road 19. He set down his coffee cup. "Holloway? You mean Eli's lodge? He was our grandfather." The man studied us for a long moment. "I'm Hank Pellerin. I was a friend of your grandfather's. Hunted with him every fall for 30 years. He looked at Caleb. "You've got his eyes, son." Caleb stood up a little straighter. "Hank told us the lodge was about 9 miles up the road. He said it had been empty since Eli passed. He said he drove by it sometimes just to check the roof. He said in the voice of a man who had been doing a small kindness for a dead friend for 5 years and had stopped expecting anyone to notice. "You got a way out there?" he asked. We were going to walk. He looked out the window at the dusk gathering between the pines. "It's going to freeze tonight. You'll walk into a ditch before you get 3 miles. He pulled a set of truck keys off a hook. "Lock up for me, would you, Marlene?" he called toward the back. A woman's voice answered something I didn't catch. Hank looked at me. "Get in the truck." I almost cried then. I didn't. I'd learned a long time ago that cry was a luxury you save for when you were already safe. The drive out to Lodge was 9 miles of road that grew narrower and darker with every turn. Hank didn't ask why we were there. He didn't ask where our mother was. He just drove, and at one point he said almost to himself, "Eli always said this place was for his grandkids." Said it more than once. Folks thought he was just talking. The driveway was exactly the way my grandfather had described it. A break in the trees that looked like nothing. Hank turned in, and the truck's headlights swept across a low log building set back in a clearing, with a stone chimney and a porch that ran the length of the front. The roof sagged in one corner. A shutter hung crooked, but it was standing. It was standing. Caleb whispered, "Is that ours?" "I think so," I said. The brass key fit the lock. It took both my hands and most of my weight to turn it, but it turned. The door swung open onto a darkness that smelled of cold ash and cedar and old wool, and underneath all of it, faintly, the ghost of pipe tobacco, the smell of my grandfather. I had not known I remembered it until that moment. Hank came in behind us with a flashlight. The main room was bigger than I'd expected. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall. There was a long pine table, 4 mismatched chairs, a leather couch sunk in the middle from years of being sat on, a kitchen at the back with a wood-burning cook stove, and a hand pump at the sink, 2 bedrooms of a short hallway, each with a single bed made up with quilts that had gone musty but were intact. "Power's out here from a generator," Hank said. "Eli had it running off propane. Tank's probably empty by now. Water comes from a well. Hand pump works. But the electric one needs a generator, with stove for heat, fireplace for ambience, mostly." He shone his light around. "Roof needs work. Caulking around the windows is shot, but the bones are good. Eli built her solid." I didn't know what to say. I stood in the middle of that room with my brother beside me and a stranger holding a flashlight, and for the first time since the suitcases hit the gravel, I felt something other than fear. I felt the weight of the building around me, the way the walls held the cold off, the way the ceiling kept the dark in its place. Hank seemed to understand. He set down the flashlight on the table so it pointed at the ceiling, casting a soft circle of light. "I've got a spare propane tank at my place," he said. "I'll run it out in the morning. There's a stack of firewood under a tarp on the north side. Eli always kept the seasons where seasoned. Should still be good. You know how to lay a fire, son?" He asked Caleb. Caleb nodded, which was a lie, but a brave one. "I'll show you," Hank said. He stayed for an hour. He showed Caleb how to lay a fire in the wood stove, kindling first small pieces, then larger as it caught. He showed me how to prime the hand pump at the sink, how to bleed the air out of the line. He went out to his truck and came back with a bag of groceries. He said he'd been meaning to bring up anyway. Bread, peanut butter, a dozen eggs, a pound of bacon, a jar of instant coffee, a box of oatmeal, a gallon of milk. "You can pay me back when you're settled," he said, in a voice that meant don't. Before he left, He stood in the doorway and looked at me the way adults look at children who are about to be left alone with something hard. How old are you, Wren? 16. And the boy? 12. He nodded slowly. I'm 5 miles back toward town. Pellerin's gas. You need anything? Anything. You walk down the road and flag down the first truck you see. Half the people up here knew your grandfather. They'll bring you to me. He paused. You got people coming for you? No, sir. You running from people? I thought about it. Just away from. He nodded again, like that was the right answer. All right then. Lock the door tonight. Sleep close to the stove. I'll be back in the morning with that propane. He left. Caleb and I stood in the lodge with the fire crackling the stove and the wind rising the pines outside, and I realized I had not eaten since breakfast. I made peanut butter sandwiches. We ate them sitting on the floor in front of the wood stove, because the couch smelled like mice. Caleb leaned against me. Wren. Yeah. Are we going to be okay? I thought about lying. I had been lying to him about small things all day, the way you do with younger brothers. But sitting there in our grandfather's lodge, with a fire we had built ourselves and a roof that was ours, I found I didn't want to. I don't know yet, I said, but we're somewhere. That's better than this morning. He thought about it. Okay, he said, and he meant it. That night, I slept on the couch and put Caleb in the bedroom that had been our grandfather's, under a wool blanket that smelled like cedar. I lay awake for a long time listening to the fire breathe and the wind move through the trees, and at some point I started to cry. Quiet, finally the safe kind, and I let myself. The next 2 weeks were the hardest weeks of my life, and looking back, they were also the weeks I started to become someone. Hank came back the next morning with a propane tank, a chainsaw, and a woman in her 50s he introduced as his wife, Marlene. Marlene took one look at the lodge and started giving orders. She had brought cleaning supplies. She had brought sheets. She had brought a casserole. She had, I would learn later, also called the school district in Ironwood Junction and registered Caleb under a story about cousins visiting from downstate, which would buy us time. You can't stay enrolled where you were, she told me bluntly, sitting at the pine table with a cup of coffee. If you do, your stepfather files a missing persons or custody complaint, and the state comes to the boy. You're 16. In Michigan, that's old enough to be considered a runaway, but not old enough to live alone with a minor. We need to fix that. How? I asked. My nephew is a family lawyer in Marquette. Did your grandfather leave a will? I don't know. She nodded. We'll find out. Marlene Pellerin was a force. She had been a teacher for 30 years before she retired. She had a way of looking at a problem like it had personally insulted her, and then methodically dismantling it. Within a week, she had located my grandfather's will through the county courthouse. He had, in fact, left the lodge and the 43 acres it sat on jointly to any direct grandchildren upon their majority or in the event of demonstrated need. The will had been filed and forgotten because my mother, listed as executor, had told the court there were no minor grandchildren in need. Marlene's nephew, a man named Curtis, drove up from Marquette on a Saturday and sat at our pine table with paperwork. He explained that demonstrated need was a clause the probate judge would have to interpret. He explained that 2 siblings, ages 16 and 12, who had been put out of their home by a non-biological step-parent, with a biological mother declined to intervene, was, in a professional opinion, a textbook case. We can petition for emergency guardianship, he said. You as Caleb's guardian, with the lodge as your legal residence. It's unconventional, but the will gives us standing. The bigger question is whether your mother will contest. She won't, I said. I was sure. I had been sure since I saw her hand fall from the kitchen window. Curtis nodded slowly. I'll need her to sign a relinquishment. I can draft it. Someone will need to take it to her. I will, I said. He looked at me carefully. You sure? She owes me a signature. I said. It's the least she can do. 2 weeks after we'd been kicked out, Hank drove me down to our old town. He waited in the truck across the street, while I walked up to the front door of the only house I'd ever call home. Doug's truck was gone. I had timed it for his work shift. My mother answered the door in a sweater I had given her 3 Christmases ago. Her eyes went wide and then immediately, instinctively, to the driveway behind me. "He's not here," I said. "I came for a signature." She looked at the papers. She looked at me. She started to cry. And I felt nothing, which scared me more than anything else that had happened. Wren, Mom, sign it, or don't. I'm not here for a conversation. She signed it on the kitchen counter where I had eaten breakfast for 16 years. She tried to hug me. I let her, the way you let a stranger pat your shoulder at a funeral. Then I walked back to Hank's truck, and I did not look back, and I did not cry, and I have not been back to that house since. By the time the first ray of snow came in mid-November, we had a life. It wasn't a comfortable life. The lodge's roof leaked in 3 places when it rained, and we put pots under the drips and emptied them like clockwork. The well froze twice, and Hank had to come out and thaw the line. The wood stove ate firewood faster than I could split it, and my hands developed calluses that cracked open the cold and bled into my mittens. But we had a life. Caleb was enrolled at Ironwood Junction Middle School. The bus picked him up at the end of our long driveway every morning at 7:14. Marlene had personally arranged it, which I suspect involved bullying the superintendent over a cup of coffee. I had enrolled in an online high school program that Curtis helped me find, one that accepted students in unusual circumstances. I did my coursework at the pine table by the wood stove, and the soft circle of light from a lamp Hank had wired into the generator system. I worked, too. Marlene got me a job at Pellerin's Gas 3 afternoons a week, manning the register and making sandwiches at the deli counter. Hank paid me $8 an hour, which was over minimum wage for the area, and pretended not to notice when I worked through my breaks. On weekends, I stocked shelves at the feed store in town. Heavy work, lifting 50-pound bags of dog food and birdseed, but the owner, a woman named June Whitlock, said I was the best worker she'd hired in 5 years. She gave me a Christmas bonus in December that was twice what I'd expected. I sent half of every paycheck back into the lodge. New caulking, a roll of roofing felt, a real chainsaw of our own, used, that Hank helped me pick out, a pair of decent winter boots for Caleb, who had grown half an inch since we'd arrived, and split the seam on his old ones. The other half I saved. People in town started to know us. They knew us as Eli Halloway's grandkids, which carried weight. My grandfather, it turned out, had been one of those quiet local figures whose absence was felt for years after he was gone. He had loaned money to a man named Tom Friesen to keep his farm out of foreclosure in 1998, and had refused to be paid back. He had taught a generation of kids to handle a deer rifle safely through a free Saturday class he'd run out of the lodge for 15 years. He had organized a volunteer fire crew that saved a Lutheran church in 2003. Your grandfather, an old man named Walt told me at the diner one Sunday, was the kind of man who made a place better by living in it. We've been waiting on his grandkids. I didn't know how to answer that. I just nodded into my coffee. The story I want to tell you, the one I've been circling, happened in late January. By then, we had been at the lodge for 3 months. We had survived the first hard freeze. Caleb had brought home a B+ on a math test and put it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a moose. I had paid the property taxes on the lodge, $1,140, which had taken almost everything I had saved. But Curtis said it was important to establish a record of good standing. The story is this. Doug Briggs found us. I don't know how. Marlene thought it was probably my mother, that she'd gotten drunk one night and let something slip. It doesn't matter. What matters is that on a Friday afternoon in January, with a temperature at -4 and a winter storm warning posted for weekend, Doug's pickup truck came up our driveway. I was alone. Caleb was at school. The bus wouldn't drop him for another 90 minutes. I saw the truck through the window, and my stomach did something I didn't know stomachs could do. I went to the door, and I stood in it. I did not invite him in. He got out of the truck, wearing a work coat I'd never seen before. New. He looked older than I remembered, which was strange because it had only been 3 months. "Wren," he said. We need to talk. No, we don't. Your mother's worried sick. Then she should call. I'm here to bring you home. I am home. He looked past me at the lodge. I watched him take in the sagging porch, the patched roof, the smoke curling out of the stovepipe. I watched him decide what story he was going to tell. This isn't a home, sweetheart. This is a shack. You've got your brother living in a shack in the woods. What do you think CPS is going to say about that? What do you think a judge is going to say? A judge already said, I told him, we have legal guardianship paperwork, filed in October. You can ask Curtis Pellerin in Marquette. He'll be happy to send you a copy. His face changed. The smile arrived 3 seconds late, the way it always did. Wren, come on, don't be stupid about this. You should leave. Your mother wants you home. Then she can come tell me herself. He took a step toward the porch. I took a step back into the doorway and put my hand on the doorframe. I was not going to let him in. I was 16, and I weighed 120 pounds, and he was a grown man, but I had spent 3 months splitting firewood and hauling water, and I was not the girl who stood in a driveway in October. I did not know yet if I could keep him out, but I knew I was going to try. Doug, I said, and I made my voice as flat as I could. There's a storm coming in tonight. Forecasters are saying 18 inches. You need to get back on the road, or you're not going to make it out of the UP before it hits. He laughed. I'm not scared of a little snow, Wren. You should be, I said. You don't know this country. He started to say something else, and that was when the second truck came up the driveway. It was Hank's. He had, I would learn later, called the lodge at 2:30 to check on me, the way he did most weekday afternoons. And when I hadn't answered, he had gotten in his truck and driven the 9 miles. He pulled up behind Doug's truck, blocking it in, and got out slowly the way men do when they want you to know they aren't in a hurry. Afternoon, Hank said, this is a private matter. Doug said, it's on private property, Hank said, belongs to that young lady. In fact, I'm a friend of the family. I'm her stepfather. Were, I said from the doorway, were her stepfather. Hank looked at me. You want him here, Wren? No, sir. Hank looked at Doug. Then you're going to want to get back in your truck. It was a small moment. It did not involve raised voices or threats or anything cinematic. It was just an old man in a flannel shirt standing in a snowy driveway with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at a younger man and waiting. And after what felt like a very long minute, Doug got back in his truck. Hank moved his truck. Doug backed out of the driveway. We watched his taillights disappear down the road. Hank stood in the driveway for a moment, looking at the sky. He's right about one thing, Hank said. There's a storm coming. Big one. You and the boy got enough firewood. I think so. I'll bring some more by, just in case. And some groceries. You shouldn't be running low on anything when this hits. He came inside for a cup of coffee. We didn't talk about Doug. We talked about the storm and about a snowmobile Hank was thinking of selling me cheap in the spring and about Caleb's grades. When he left, he hugged me, which he had never done before. He smelled like pipe tobacco and motor oil and something else I couldn't name until later, when I realized it was the same smell as the lodge, the smell of my grandfather. Some men, I think, just carry that with them. Some men inherit it from friends they kept. The storm hit that night. 18 inches turned out to be conservative. We got 26 in 30 hours, with winds that piled drift 6 feet deep against the north side of the lodge. The power lines went down. The propane held. The wood stove burned through 3 days and 2 nights without going out because Caleb and I took shifts feeding it. We melted snow on the cook stove for water when the well pump quit. We ate from cans and from a bag of groceries Hank had brought up before the storm sealed the roads. On the second night, with the wind screaming around the corners of the lodge and the snow piled past the lower windows, Caleb sat next to me on the couch in front of the wood stove. He was wrapped in 2 of our grandfather's wool blankets. He looked, in the firelight, both younger and older than 12. Wren, he said. Yeah. If we'd stayed at the house, what would the night be like? I thought about it. The truth was, The house had a furnace and a working dishwasher and reliable internet, and walls that didn't whistle when the wind hit them. Warmer, I said, but not better. No, I agreed, not better. He nodded. He put his head on my shoulder. This is better, he said, with the certainty of a 12-year-old who has decided something, and I felt the last small piece of the old life. The small, mean voice that still sometimes whispered that I had ruined everything by saying no in our mother's kitchen. Finally let go. The storm broke on a Sunday morning. The sun came up on a world made entirely of white and pine, and the silence was so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. After 3 days of howling wind and snow that had pressed against the windows like a living thing trying to get in, the stillness felt almost holy. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time before I could make myself move, watching the way the light caught the tops of the pines and turned them silver. The drifts against the lodge were nearly 4 feet deep in places. I would have to dig a path to the woodpile before the day was much older. I made Caleb pancakes on the cook stove with the last of our milk. My hand shook a little as I measured the flour. 3 days of cold and rationed sleep, and the particular kind of vigilance that comes from being the only adult in a building during a blizzard. Even when you are 16, and the word adult still feels like something you are wearing without permission. Caleb came out of his room in sock feet, his hair standing up in the back, and he didn't say anything for a long time. He just stood beside me at the stove and watched the batter bubble and set, and the warmth of him beside me did more for my hands than the fire did. We ate at the kitchen table, watching the light move across the snow, first a pale blue, then gold, then a white, so bright it hurt to look at directly. Neither of us spoke much. There was a feeling in the room that words would have damaged. We made it, sis. Caleb finally said, very quietly, the way you say something you're still trying to believe. Yeah, I said, we made it. Hank's plow truck came up the driveway at noon. We heard the engine before we saw him. The low diesel rumble carrying across the still air from a long way off, getting closer in fits and starts as he pushed through drifts. He had bulldozed his way through 9 miles of unplowed road to check on us, and I knew without being told that the county plows hadn't reached our stretch yet, and wouldn't for another full day. When his truck finally crested the rise at the end of the driveway, I watched the snow peel off his front blade in 2 clean white waves, and something in my chest unknotted that I hadn't realized was tied. He brought eggs and coffee, and a thermos of Marlene's chicken soup. He stood in the doorway in his old Carhartt and stamped the snow off his boots and looked at us. Caleb in his sock feet, me with flowers still in front of my sweater, and his eyes did the quiet thing again. The thing I had first seen in October, when we had knocked on his door at the end of the dirt road and asked, with all the shaking dignity I could muster, whether he had known a man named Eli Halloway. His eyes had gone soft and old and steady, and he had said I knew him, and that had been the beginning of everything. Now those same eyes took us in, alive, fed, in a warm kitchen, and they did not look surprised so much as confirmed. You made it, he said. We made it. He stayed for lunch. I heated the soup on the cook stove and cut bread, and the 3 of us sat at the kitchen table, while the light kept doing its slow work outside. Caleb asked about Hank's dog Max, and Hank laughed and said Max had spent the entire storm with his head on Hank's boot, like he was the one keeping Hank safe instead of the other way around. Caleb laughed at that, a Real laugh, the first one I had heard from him in days, and I had to look down at my soup for a minute because my throat had gone tight. Before he left, Hank told me Doug Briggs's truck had been found in a ditch on County Road 12, 20 miles south. Doug had walked 4 hours in a blizzard before a snowplow picked him up. He had frostbite on 3 fingers and was going to lose par 1. He had been airlifted to Marquette General. Didn't know the country, Hank said, repeating my words back to me without judgment. I felt nothing. I had expected to feel something, vindication, maybe, or pity, or fear at how close it had come, and instead there was just a calm, flat space where those feelings might have been. Doug had walked into a storm I had warned him about. The storm had answered. The lodge had held. That, I think, is the moment I started to understand what my grandfather had left us. He had not left us a building. He had left us a place where the rules were different, where the cold told the truth, where a person became, very quickly, exactly who they actually were. People in town had laughed at us in October. Not unkindly. Most of them had been gentle about it. But they had laughed. 2 kids in Eli's old lodge, through a UP winter, with no power and a wood stove. They gave us 6 weeks. Some of them gave us 3. The first time I had walked into Pellerin's gas for kerosene, the man behind the counter had looked at me the way you look at someone who has made a mistake you can't fix for them. June Whitlock at the feed store had given me tea and a chair, and that particular kind of kindness people offer when they don't believe what you're attempting is possible. The principal at Caleb's school had taken me aside on his first day and asked careful questions about our arrangement, her voice full of concern that was actually doubt. They stopped laughing when the snow came. They stopped laughing when a 16-year-old girl and her 12-year-old brother walked into Pellerin's gas on the Monday after the storm with split firewood to sell, having gotten through 3 days of whiteout on a wood stove and a hand pump and the good bones of an old man's lodge. June Whitlock at the feed store told me later that half the town had been holding its breath through that storm, waiting to hear we were okay. The sheriff had driven past the end of our road twice on Saturday, she said, and turned around because the drifts were too deep, and he had sat at the diner that night nursing a coffee and not saying much. When word got around that we were fine, that Hank had reached us, that there was smoke coming out of the chimney, that we were already cutting wood again, something shifted. We weren't the kids in the lodge anymore. We were Eli's grandkids who had made it through. People started nodding when I came into stores. Carl at the hardware store began quietly knocking dollars off my receipts, never saying anything, just writing new numbers at the bottom in pencil. June set aside an old wool blanket for me and told me it had been my grandfather's, which we both knew was a kind lie. Caleb's teacher started lingering over his homework, writing comments in the margins, sent him home with extra books. The lady at the post office learned our names. I realized one afternoon, walking back to my truck with a bag of groceries in each hand, that we had stopped trying to prove anything. We had already proved it. I'm going to stop here for a second, because I want to ask you something. If you've ever been told you couldn't do something, if you've ever had someone laugh at you for trying, I want you to leave a comment below. Tell me what you proved them wrong about. Tell me what your snow was. Because every one of us has a winter we weren't supposed to make it through, and I think the people who made it deserve to be heard. Hit subscribe if this story is sitting with you, and stay with me, because there's a little more to tell. Spring came. It came the way spring comes in the UP, late, reluctant. With one last snowstorm in April that buried the daffodils Marlene had given us a plant. But it came. The icicles dropped off the eaves one by one, leaving wet dark stripes on the siding. The river behind the woodlet started to talk again under its skin of ice, a low mumbling sound at first, then a real voice. The roof stopped leaking when Hank and I spent a weekend re-shingling it. Standing up there with a hammer in my hand and a nail between my teeth, looking out over 43 acres of land that was ours, I understood for the first time that this place was a living thing. It needed feeding. It needed mending. It would sometimes ask things of me I didn't know I had. The well pump came back online once the ground unfroze. Caleb's grades climbed. He went from AB to an A in math, and his English teacher wrote me a letter saying that Caleb's writing had a maturity unusual in boys his age, which I taped to the refrigerator and which still hangs there. I finished my online sophomore year with a 3.8 GPA, which my advisor said was unusual for students in non-traditional living situations. I told her I had a wood stove and a quiet table and a brother who needed me to set an example, and she should add that to the research. She laughed, then she didn't, and then she asked if she could write about us in the paper she was working on. I said no. Some things aren't for papers. My mother called once in March. She left a voicemail saying she had left Doug, that she was staying with her sister in Saginaw, that she wanted to come see us. I didn't call back for 4 days. For 4 days, I walked around the lodge with stone in my chest. Caleb asked me what was wrong, and I said nothing, and he didn't believe me, but he let it go, the way he had learned to let things go in our old house. At night, sitting in front of the stove with my knees pulled up, I tried to remember my mother's face. The last time I'd seen it clearly, that August morning in the kitchen, her hand sliding softly down the window glass while Doug stood behind her, and I understood that I was not the girl who had walked out of that house anymore. The girl who walked out of that house would have called back the same day, crying, "Ready to be a daughter again on whatever terms were offered." I wasn't her. I was someone who had carried a brother through a winter. When I did call back, I told her she could write letters and that we would write back. I told her that anything beyond that was a conversation we would have when Caleb was older and when I had decided. She cried. I let her. Then I hung up, and I went outside and split firewood for an hour, and I felt, when I came back in, like a person who had made a decision rather than a person who had been broken by one. The lodge is ours. Curtis filed the final paperwork in May. 43 acres, the building, the well, the woodlet. The property tax is manageable now that I know how to budget for it. We've made improvements. A new generator, real insulation in the walls, a solar setup Hank helped me install on the south-facing roof, the panels catching that long northern light. Caleb has his own room, properly his, with a desk and a bookshelf and posters on the wall, a topographic map of the UP, a poster of the night sky, a photograph of him and Hank standing in front of a buck Hank shot last November. Sometimes at night, after Caleb is asleep and the stove is burned down to a low orange glow, I stand in the main room and look at this place. The hand-hewn beams my grandfather cut himself, the fieldstone hearth he built one stone at a time, the window casings that still carry the marks of his plane. I feel him in a room with me in those moments, not as a ghost, as a piece of the architecture. Last fall, on the anniversary of the day we arrived, I drove down to the cemetery in our old town, and I stood in front of my grandfather's grave for the first time. I had never been before. It had not felt like something I could do until I had earned it, and that's a stupid way to think about visiting a dead man, but it was the way I thought about it. I stood there in the October light, and I told him about the lodge. I told him about the storm. I told him about Caleb's grades and Hank's friendship and the woman at the feed store who had become like an aunt to me. I told him I had been 11 when he had pressed a key into my hand, and that I was sorry it had taken me 5 years to understand him, and that I understood him now. I left the brass key on his headstone for an hour, because it felt right, and I picked it up and put it back in my pocket, because the lodge was still standing and it would still need locking. Here is the thing I have learned, and the thing I want to leave you with. People will tell you what you can survive. They will tell you what you deserve. They will tell you, sometimes with their words, and sometimes just with the soft fall of a hand against a kitchen window, that you are not worth the fight. They are wrong. There are people in this world who've been quietly fighting for you before you ever knew their names. There are old men in flannel shirts who knew your grandfather and who will drive 9 miles in a snowstorm because you didn't answer phone at 2:30. There are retired teachers who will register your brother for school under a story they invented on the spot. There are women at feed stores who will set aside a wool blanket and call it your grandfather's. There are buildings, sometimes, that someone built decades ago without ever telling you, just in case you needed them. The world is full of these small, stubborn, hidden genera, and most of them will never make a sound. You have to be willing to look. You have to be willing to walk 9 miles down a dark road, or take a key out of a jewelry box, or knock on a stranger's door at a gas station and say, "I am looking for the old Holloway place." You have to be willing to believe that you are someone worth looking. I was not, in October, that kind of person. I am now. The lodge made me. The cold made me. My brother, who needed me to be brave, and who therefore made me brave, made me. My grandfather, who had been dead for 5 years, and who reached forward through that time with one small brass key, made me. If you are sitting somewhere right now with a suitcase you are afraid to pick up, I want you to know this. The people who told you that you couldn't are wrong. The place you are looking for might already be waiting. Someone might have built it for you a long time ago. You just have to be brave enough to find the door. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. Share it with someone who needs it. And tell me in the comments, what was your lodge? What did you find when you finally went looking? Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. I read everyone. I always will. Because the only thing better than surviving your own winter is hearing about someone else who survived theirs. Thank you for being here. Stay warm. Stay stubborn. The snow doesn't last forever, and the people who love you sometimes leave you keys.